You left the church. Maybe it was 5 years ago, maybe 20. Maybe the leaving happened in pieces. A question here, a doubt there, a book you weren't supposed to read that made it impossible to go back to the way things were before. However it happened, at some point you stopped believing the central thing. You stopped believing that a God who knows everything that will ever happen created a world where most people would suffer forever and called it love. You looked at what the evidence actually says about the texts, about the history, about the councils and the translations and the manuscripts, and you followed the evidence wherever it led. Even when it led somewhere the church didn't want you to go, your head left. That part was hard. But you did it. You made peace with uncertainty. You built something real on the other side of it. And then it's 2 a.m. And there it is. The guilt. Not guilt about anything specific. Not guilt you can argue down with evidence. Not guilt that responds to logic or to history or to every reasonable thing you now know about how the Bible was written and revised and selectively assembled over centuries by human beings with agendas. Just guilt. Background guilt. The kind that sits in your chest before you're fully awake. The sense that something is wrong with you at a level that predates every thought you've ever had about it. The sense that you are being watched, and that whatever is watching you is not satisfied. If you've felt this, you know exactly what I'm describing. And if you've felt it for years after leaving, if you've had your theology completely dismantled and rebuilt, and you still wake up at 2 a.m. with that feeling, you've probably asked the question I spent years trying to answer. Why doesn't the guilt go away when the belief does? Here's the answer most people give. Pastors say it's God's voice calling you back. Therapists say it's a trauma response, that the nervous system doesn't update its programming the way the conscious mind updates its conclusions. Friends say it's just what happens when you've believed something deeply for a long time. That the grief of leaving is like any other grief. That it takes time. That you loved something and leaving it hurts, and the hurt doesn't follow a schedule. All of those explanations have something true in them. But none of them answers the question I actually needed answered. Not why does the guilt persist, but where did the guilt come from in the first place? What is it exactly that got installed? When was it installed? And by whom? Because here's what nobody told me when I left. What nobody told me in all the years I sat in the pew as a deacon, and in all the years I spent slowly, carefully, painfully walking away from it. What my seminary professor didn't tell me, what my pastor didn't tell me, what the tradition I was born into never once mentioned in 50 years of sermons and Sunday school lessons and committee meetings about the proper doctrine of human sin. That guilt has a birthday. It was voted on by a council in North Africa in the year 418. I can tell you who designed it. I can tell you the exact date it became official. I can tell you what they were afraid of when they designed it. I can tell you the specific translation error it was built on. A single error the man who designed it could not detect because he could not read the language the original text was written in. And I can tell you why. Once you understand the mechanics of how that guilt was installed, the 2 a.m. feeling starts to make a completely different kind of sense. There are 4 layers to this, and the last one is the one that no church I ever attended was willing to say out loud. Before we go there, one thing first. If you're watching this, something in the title resonated. Something about that guilt, the kind that doesn't respond to reason, that outlasts the belief itself, felt familiar. Maybe uncomfortably familiar. Subscribing is what tells the algorithm to keep bringing you this kind of investigation. The parts that stayed out of the Sunday sermon. The parts that biblical scholarship has known for decades and the church never mentioned. We have 3 more layers to go. And the third one, the one about a translation error and what it was architecturally designed to accomplish, is the one I wish someone had handed me on a piece of paper the day I walked out the door for the last time. Let me start where I should have started 30 years ago. On the very first Sunday, I woke up and couldn't make myself get in the car and drive to church. Not with Augustine. Not yet. Not with councils or translation errors or political maneuvering in 5th century North Africa. With 260 million people who were never taught what you were taught. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the oldest continuous Christian tradition in the world, stretching from the earliest communities in Jerusalem and Antioch through Constantinople into the present day, does not teach that you were born guilty. I want to say that very clearly, because the first time I encountered it, I thought I had misread it. 260 million Orthodox Christians, Greek, Russian, Romanian, Serbian, Ethiopian, Coptic, Antiochian, and dozens of other traditions, have been practicing Christianity for 2,000 years. They believe in Adam. They believe in the fall. They believe something went wrong in the Garden of Eden, and that this wrongness touched everything that came after. They read the same Bible. They pray to the same God. They celebrate the same Christmas and Easter. They have the Eucharist and baptism and confession. But they do not believe that Adam's guilt transferred to you before you took your first breath. Now here's the thing I need you to understand about why this matters. Western Christianity, the tradition that shaped you, whether you were raised Catholic, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Evangelical, Fundamentalist, or any of 50 other Protestant denominations, teaches what theologians call original sin. But not just original sin in some general sense. It teaches Augustinian original sin, a very specific version of the doctrine formalized by one man in the early 5th century. The belief that when Adam sinned, his guilt was transmitted biologically to every human being who would ever live. You arrived in this world already condemned. Not just mortal, not just weakened, not just prone to making mistakes, condemned. Guilty before you did anything. Guilty for what Adam did in a garden before you existed. Eastern Orthodoxy teaches something called ancestral sin. The difference is not cosmetic. It is not a difference in terminology that amounts to the same thing. It is the difference between a legal verdict and a medical diagnosis. In the Eastern understanding, what humans inherit from Adam is mortality, the fact of death, and a weakened tendency toward sin. A fragile will. A nature that finds the wrong thing easier than the right thing. What the fall transmitted was real damage, yes, spiritual damage. A world that doesn't work the way it was supposed to. But not guilt, not legal condemnation, not the verdict that you are, from birth, in a state of culpable wrongdoing before God. In the Eastern tradition, you bear the guilt of your own acts and only your own acts. What you inherit from Adam is the world his choice created. A world of mortality and struggle and temptation and death. But not the verdict he earned by making that choice. You arrive clean. Damaged by the world you were born into? Yes, but not already condemned for something you had nothing to do with. Metropolitan Hierotheos Vlachos of the Greek Orthodox Church said it as plainly as it can be said. We do not accept the teaching of inherited guilt, not as a modern revision, not as an accommodation to secular sensibilities, not as progressive theology trying to soften the hard edges of tradition, as the continuous, unbroken position of the Eastern Church from its beginning. Now, let me be careful here, because I'm not telling you that the Eastern position is correct or that Western Christianity got everything wrong. I'm telling you something more specific and more immediately useful. If 260 million Christians have practiced their faith for 2,000 years without being told they arrived in the world already condemned, if the oldest continuous stream of Christianity takes a fundamentally different position on whether guilt is something you're born with or something you earn, then what you were raised to feel as the foundation of everything is not universal Christian teaching. It is a specific Western position, a position that has a specific inventor, a specific moment of formalization, and a specific opposition that it defeated to become dominant, which means the 2 a.m. guilt you're carrying is not an inevitable consequence of the Christian faith. It is a specific product of a specific version of that faith. And specific products have specific origins. Stay with me on this, because here is where it starts to get genuinely unsettling. The Eastern Church's different position is not just a theological curiosity. It produces a different human experience on the way out. When people raised in Eastern Orthodox traditions undergo what we in the West call deconstruction, when they lose their faith, when they stop believing, when they walk away from the religion they were raised in, they do not typically report the same persistent, somatic 2 a.m. guilt that Western ex-Christians describe. Not in the same way, not with the same persistence, not with the same quality of feeling watched and condemned in the absence of any specific act. That difference is not because Eastern Christians are less devout, or because the Eastern faith is less serious, or because leaving it hurts less. It is because the Eastern tradition never installed the specific program that produces that specific experience. The persistent guilt of the Western ex-Christian is not a universal feature of leaving religion. It is a feature of leaving a religion that told you you were born already guilty. And the thing that told you that, the mechanism that produced the installation, has a history. A specific, documentable, historically verifiable history. A history with dates and names and council records and Latin translations and a British monk and a North African bishop who could not read Greek. That history starts not in Eden, but in December of the year 415, in a city in Palestine called Diospolis. December 415. The place is Diospolis in Palestine, the city the Romans called Lydda, which is now the Israeli city of Lod, about 30 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. 14 bishops have gathered for what is called the Synod of Diospolis. The presiding bishop is John of Jerusalem, one of the senior ecclesiastical figures in the Eastern Church. On trial is a British monk named Pelagius, who has been living in Palestine for several years after fleeing Rome when the Visigoth king Alaric sacked the city in 410. Pelagius is not a marginal figure. He is not some radical troublemaker operating on the fringes of the faith. He is one of the most respected religious teachers of his generation, admired for his personal austerity, his careful reading of Scripture, his influence on wealthy Roman Christians who found his ethical seriousness compelling. He has corresponded with Jerome, one of the most respected biblical scholars of the age. He has been welcomed in episcopal courts. By any measure, he is someone whose theology deserves to be heard on its merits. The charges against Pelagius, number 14. They have been compiled and presented by a young Spanish priest named Orosius, an ally of Augustine of Hippo, who has traveled specifically from North Africa to Palestine with the assignment of pressing the case that Pelagius is a heretic. The core of the heresy, according to Augustine's camp, Pelagius denies that Adam's sin transmitted guilt to his descendants. He teaches that each human being arrives in the world morally neutral, that each soul is created fresh, capable of choosing good without requiring a special divine intervention to remove an inherited stain they never earned. He teaches that sin is a choice, not a condition, and therefore, in Pelagius's view, no one is born guilty. There is an immediate procedural problem at the Synod of Diospolis. The proceedings are conducted in Greek. Orosius speaks Latin. John of Jerusalem, who presides, asks Orosius to have his charges translated. The proceedings stretch across 2 sessions over 2 days. Pelagius responds to each of the 14 charges. He clarifies positions that have been misrepresented. He distinguishes his actual theology from more extreme formulations that his opponents have attributed to him. He disavows certain followers who have taken his ideas further than he intended. He is, by the record of the proceedings, a careful and articulate theological respondent. At the end of the 2 sessions, the 14 bishops deliberate and return their verdict, acquitted on all 14 counts. The formal record, which still exists, and which we know specifically because Augustine himself preserved it in a polemical work he wrote to challenge it, reads, and I'm quoting directly, "We adjudge him to belong to the communion of the Catholic Church, 14 bishops, in Palestine, in the year 415, having examined the evidence, heard the accused in person, reviewed each of the 14 charges, reached the formal conclusion that the man who said you are not born guilty is not a heretic, that he belongs in the Church, that his teaching is within the bounds of acceptable Christian doctrine." If you've never heard of this, if this is the first time you're learning that at the moment the guilt doctrine was being formalized, it was examined by a council of bishops who looked at the evidence and disagreed, that is not an accident. That absence from what you were taught is itself part of the story. Augustine was informed of the Diospolus acquittal. He did not reconsider his position. He did not write to John of Jerusalem to understand how the Eastern bishops had reasoned. He did not engage seriously with the possibility that the men who had examined Pelagius firsthand, in person, in his own language, might have seen something that merited their verdict. He spent the next 3 years writing a book, not a letter, not a short treatise, a full book, De Gestis Pelagii, on the proceedings of Pelagius, dedicated entirely to explaining why 14 bishops who had examined the evidence and acquitted Pelagius had gotten it wrong, why their verdict should be disregarded, why the Western councils should override the Eastern judgment. Think about what it takes to do that. Think about what it requires, in terms of institutional ambition, theological conviction, and political calculation. To write an entire book explaining why a council got it wrong, not because you can point to a procedural error, not because the accused lied, but because the conclusion they reached was one that you could not allow to stand. The machinery moved quickly after that. Pope Innocent V, who had been in regular correspondence with Augustine and the North African bishops throughout the Pelagian controversy, excommunicated Pelagius in 417. Innocent died shortly afterward. His successor, Zosimus, initially sided with Pelagius, writing to the North African churches that Pelagius and his associate Caelestius were of unimpaired faith. The North African bishops pressured the imperial court. Political pressure was applied to Rome. Zosimus reversed his position. By 418, with the Council of Carthage convened in North Africa, the verdict was sealed. Canon 2. It still exists in the historical record. You can look it up. Whoever says that Adam's sin harmed only Adam himself and not his posterity, or that he transmitted to all men only death of the body, which is the punishment of sin, and not the sin itself, which is the death of the soul, let him be anathema. Let him be cut off. You are not born merely mortal, says Canon 2. You are not born merely weakened, merely prone to error. You are born with the sin itself, the death of the soul. Already upon you, the inherited condemnation, the guilt of Adam's act, transmitted to you before you drew breath, before you thought a thought, before you made a single choice. That canon, voted on in North Africa in 418, following the political overturning of an Eastern acquittal, is the birthday of the guilt you wake up with at 2 in the morning. The guilt was not handed down from Jesus. It was not the unanimous position of the early church. It was not even the position of the church in the generation before Augustine, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, John Chrysostom. All the major pre-Augustinian theologians treated sin as an individual act, not an inherited condition. It was voted on in 418 over the documented objection of Eastern bishops who examined the evidence and reached a different conclusion. The Council of Orange in 529, a full century after Augustine died, had to reinforce the Augustinian position again, issuing its own canons against what the council called the error of Pelagius. That's a century of institutional effort to maintain a doctrine against persistent theological challenge. You don't reinforce a settled matter. You reinforce something that keeps coming loose. And here is where I need to tell you something that took me a long time to say clearly, even to myself. Even knowing all of that, the political reversal, the overturned Eastern verdict, the century of institutional reinforcement, there is still a question I didn't ask for years after I first learned this history. Not how the guilt doctrine was installed, but why? Why would theologically serious, intellectually capable, genuinely faithful people fight so hard to establish that every human being arrives in the world already condemned? What is the advantage of that? What does it do for an institution to make inherited guilt the foundation of everything? To answer that, you need to understand what Pelagius was actually teaching, not the caricature Augustine spent 15 years constructing, the straw man of a man who denied God's grace and thought humans didn't need divine help. But what Pelagius actually said. Pelagius taught that each human soul arrives in the world morally neutral. That sin is an act of individual will, not an inherited condition you were born with. That Adam's sin set a pattern, established a terrible precedent that human beings have been following ever since, but did not transmit legal guilt to people who had nothing to do with it. He taught that humans can, with God's assistance, choose good, that the capacity for moral choice is real, and that God holds people responsible only for choices that are actually within their power to make. And, crucially, most controversially, most dangerously, he taught that you do not need an institutional sacrament to receive God's grace, that divine assistance is available directly, that you don't need a priest standing between you and God to remove a guilt that Pelagius didn't believe you were born with. Now think about what that means for an institution. If you're born innocent, if guilt is only ever the result of your own specific freely chosen acts, then baptism is not removing an inherited stain that you could not remove yourself. It's a meaningful ritual, a beautiful sacrament, a public declaration of faith. But it is not doing something structurally irreplaceable. You don't need it to remove something you were never born with. And if baptism is not removing an inherited guilt that only the sacrament can wash away, then the priest performing it is not performing an act that only he can perform. And if the priest's role is not structurally irreplaceable, then the institutional hierarchy built on that irreplaceability begins to loosen its grip. The sacramental system, baptism, confession, absolution, the Eucharist, the mediation of the Church between the human being and God, loses the specific leverage it has over people who believe they arrived in the world already condemned. If Pelagius is right, you can go directly. You don't need the institution as the intermediary between yourself and the guilt you were taught you were born with. That is why 14 Eastern bishops acquitted him in 415 and North African councils condemned him in 418. That is why Augustine spent 15 years and a book and a campaign of letters to Rome, ensuring that Pelagius's position was not just refuted, but anathematized. And now I have to tell you what the guilt doctrine was actually built on. Because what I've described so far, the political victory, the overturned acquittal, the institutional calculation, is the frame. The foundation beneath the frame is something even more specific. Augustine built his doctrine of inherited guilt on a single verse. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. In the King James translation, the one most of us grew up with, it reads, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." That last clause, "for that all have sinned." In the Latin text, Augustine used the Old Latin Bible, the Vetus Latina, the version that was standard in the Latin-speaking Western Church. This phrase was rendered "in quo omnes peccaverunt," in whom all sinned. In whom? Meaning, in Adam. The entire human race sinned inside Adam's body. Before birth, before thought, before any individual act of will, the sin was inherited, transmitted biologically from Adam to every human being who would ever come after him. You didn't choose to sin. You were born a sinner. The guilt precedes your existence. This is the foundation of the doctrine. Augustine built everything on this reading. Now I need you to hear what the verse actually says. The original text of Romans, the letter Paul wrote, the text that exists in the oldest Greek manuscripts we possess, uses the phrase "epho," two Greek words. They mean because of which, inasmuch as, for the reason that. The sentence in Greek reads, "Death spread to all people. Epho, because of which, for which reason, all sinned. Not in whom, not inside Adam, because of the situation that death created, because of the world that mortality made, because death spread, and in that world of death all people sinned." Augustine's Latin said in quo, in whom. Paul's Greek said epho, because of which. Two words. One translation decision made by an anonymous translator working from Greek into Latin, probably in the 3rd or early 4th century. The difference between two entirely different understandings of what the fall means for every human being who follows Adam. And here is the part that I want you to sit with. Augustine of Hippo, Bishop of Hippo Regius, one of the most important theological figures in the history of Western Christianity, the man whose reading of Romans 5:12 became the foundation of how hundreds of millions of people feel about themselves before God, could not read Greek fluently. He acknowledged this in his correspondence. He was educated in a Latin-speaking North African world. Latin was the language of his theology, his training, his entire intellectual life. The Greek texts of the New Testament, the texts Paul actually wrote, Augustine accessed through Latin translations, and the Latin translation he used said, in quo. In whom? The entire doctrine of inherited guilt, the doctrine that produces the guilt that outlasts your belief by years, possibly decades, was built on a Latin rendering of a Greek phrase that the man who built the doctrine could not evaluate in the original language. And the original, in Greek, does not say what Augustine's Latin said. John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople, one of the greatest preachers in the history of the Eastern Church, writing at almost exactly the same moment in history as Augustine, in the same decade, in the same century, read Romans 5:12 in the original Greek and understood it entirely differently. He wrote, in his homilies on Romans, "How did all sin in Adam? He was the type, not the cause, the entrance, not the enforcement." Same verse, one man reading it in Greek, one man reading it in Latin, two completely opposite conclusions about what the fall transmitted to the human race. Chrysostom's reading, Adam as type, not as cause, as the entrance through which death came, not as the mechanism by which guilt was transmitted, is precisely the Eastern position. Precisely the position that the Eastern Church has maintained for 2,000 years. And Chrysostom reached that position not by coordinating with Pelagius, not by arguing against Augustine, but by reading the verse in the language it was written in. The Eastern Church followed Chrysostom, the Western Church followed Augustine. And the guilt you wake up with at 2 in the morning, the guilt that doesn't respond to the evidence you've gathered since leaving, the guilt that persists after the belief has been systematically dismantled, is the product of following the man who read it in Latin. And here's what I need you to hear, because this is the deepest layer. This is what nobody told me. This is what my seminary professor never mentioned in an entire semester on early church theology. The guilt doctrine was not a theological accident that happened to have institutional consequences. It was architecture. It was designed to do exactly what it does: create a problem you were born with that only the institution can resolve. If you carry inherited guilt, if the condemnation is encoded in your nature before you think your first thought, then baptism is not a symbol. It's removing something real, something you could not remove yourself. And if baptism is removing something only baptism can remove, then the priest performing it is doing something irreplaceable. And if the priest is doing something irreplaceable, then the institutional hierarchy that authorizes the priest's authority is doing something you cannot live well without. If you're born condemned, you need the church, not as a community, not as a source of meaning, not as a context for prayer and song and shared grief. You need it as the exclusive mediator between the guilt you were born with and the God who can remove it. Pelagius's position, that you arrive morally neutral, that guilt is only ever the result of your own choices, that you can go directly to God without institutional mediation, removes the church from the equation. Not completely, not forever, but at the most foundational level. It removes the load-bearing beam. It dissolves the necessity. That is not a theological disagreement. That is an existential threat to the institution, and that is why the man who said it was condemned not despite the Eastern bishop's acquittal, but in direct response to it. The acquittal had to be overturned precisely because it threatened to stand. Because if Pelagius's position was accepted in the East and had a fair hearing in the West, the architectural logic of Western Christianity, the logic that makes you need the church in a way that cannot be satisfied by anything other than the church, begins to come apart. Spinoza named this mechanism in the 4th chapter of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, writing in 1670. He didn't name Augustine. He named the structure. The supreme secret of despotism, he wrote, is not to keep people from knowing the truth by force. It is to convince them that they cannot trust their own reason, to make the gap between the person and salvation large enough that only the institution can bridge it, to make the human being feel fundamentally insufficient, incapable, without mediation, of access to what they need most. The guilt doctrine is that secret given biological form. It doesn't just make you need the church, it makes you need it at a level that reason cannot reach, because the guilt isn't in your beliefs, it lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the part of you that fires its signals before you're fully awake. That's not an accident. That's what the architecture was built to produce. Now go back for a moment to where we started. The thing I said at the beginning, that the guilt after leaving is just natural, that it's a spiritual hangover. What happens when you've believed something deeply and then it falls away? That it takes time. Now you know what that explanation was covering. It was presenting the architecture as landscape, as if the guilt was always there, as if it grew from the ground, as if it is simply what human beings feel in the absence of God, as if it is testimony to something eternal rather than something dated. The guilt that stays after the belief leaves is not your conscience. It is not God's voice. It is not evidence that somewhere inside you still wonders if you were wrong. It is a mechanism. It was designed in 418. It was installed over the documented objection of 14 Eastern bishops who examined the evidence and disagreed. It was built on a Latin translation error that the man who designed it could not detect. It was designed to outlast the belief that carries it, because the belief will eventually be questioned. But the somatic response, the guilt in the body, the 2 a.m. surveillance, that was built to run deeper. And if you're feeling it right now, if you left the church and the guilt is still there, that is not proof that you were wrong to leave. It is proof that the installation worked. Let me stop here for a moment before the final layer. If the history of Diospolis, the acquittal, the translation error, the architectural logic, if any of that just rearranged something for you, then what you received in the last several minutes took years to put together. Years of following footnotes that nobody reads from a pulpit. Years of interlibrary loans and used bookstores and late evenings with historians who did the work that the tradition never wanted done. Super thanks is how viewers who've received something real signal that it mattered. It's not a transaction. It's a record. It's how this kind of investigation continues. We have one more layer, and this is the one that's about you. Specifically now, in the life you're living. I'm going to tell you something now that took me about 3 years after leaving the church to understand clearly enough to say. I was a deacon for 22 years. I taught Sunday school. I sat in committee meetings where serious, faithful men discussed the proper doctrine of human sin, the correct understanding of what theologians call total depravity, the truth that human beings are, from birth, oriented away from God by a corruption we didn't choose and can't cure by our own effort. I believed this not as an abstraction, but as a felt reality. I believed that the guilt I carried was evidence of something true about me, that it was what the Bible calls conviction of sin, the Holy Spirit's way of keeping me honest with myself. I believed this even when I couldn't name what I was guilty of. Even when I woke up at 2 a.m. with the guilt already there before a single conscious thought had formed. Even when I prayed it away and it came back, I thought the persistence was the point. That was why you needed the church, to give that guilt somewhere to go. One of my professors at the Baptist college I attended, I'll just call him a professor, the institution doesn't matter, spent an entire semester on early church theology. He was good at it. He was thorough, careful, deeply read. He taught Augustine's doctrine of original sin with authority and clarity. He walked us through the key texts, the key arguments, the logic of inherited guilt, and the necessity of divine grace. He never mentioned the Synod of Diospolis. He never mentioned that 14 Eastern bishops had examined Pelagius in person and found him orthodox. He never mentioned Bishop John of Jerusalem, who presided over that synod. He never mentioned that Augustine wrote an entire book specifically to challenge that acquittal. He never mentioned that Zosimus, the pope who succeeded Innocent of Phryne, initially sided with Pelagius and had to be pressured into reversing that position. He never mentioned John Chrysostom's reading of Romans 5:12, even though Chrysostom wrote it in Greek, in the language Paul actually used. He never mentioned that the Eastern Church, 260 million Christians practicing the same faith, does not accept inherited guilt, that they never did, that their tradition took a different path, and has never returned to the Western position. I learned all of that alone. In my kitchen, years after I'd left the church, with a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, reading Elaine Pagel's book, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, which had been sitting in print since 1988, available at any library, available in any used bookstore for a few dollars. The professor knew. He had to have known. You cannot teach that level of early church theology without encountering the Diospolis acquittal. You cannot teach Augustine's anti-Pelagian works without knowing what he was arguing against. You cannot teach the Council of Carthage in 418 without knowing that it overturned an Eastern verdict issued 3 years earlier. You cannot teach the doctrine of original sin without knowing that Chrysostom, writing in Greek at the same time, reached the opposite conclusion from the same verse. He knew, and he did not tell us. I'm not sure how to say this without it sounding like bitterness, because it isn't bitterness exactly. It's something colder than that. The recognition that the guilt I spent 22 years carrying, the guilt I still carried for years after leaving, was protected by the silence of people who knew its history and chose not to share it. Darrell Ray, who spent 20 years studying the psychology of religious guilt, calls the mechanism a virus, not metaphorically, but descriptively, a self-replicating psychological program that installs itself in the emotional infrastructure of the believer and continues running after the host no longer carries the original theology. The belief is like a tenant. The guilt is structural. It's been built into the walls. Tenants leave. Walls stay. Nobody tells you about this part. Nobody warns you that when you walk out the door, the architecture doesn't come with you because you didn't choose to bring it. It's already in you. It was installed before you were old enough to evaluate what was being installed. That's why the guilt doesn't respond to the evidence. You've read Bart Ehrman. You understand textual criticism. You know about the manuscript traditions, and the missing verses, and the late additions, and the contradictions that no one ever explained satisfactorily from the pulpit. You've read the history. You know the councils were human, the canons were voted on, the translations were imperfect. You know all of this, and the guilt is still there at 2 in the morning, because the guilt was never in your theology. It was never in what you believed. It was in your body, in your nervous system. It was installed before your first conscious thought about God, in the years when you were absorbing the emotional reality of your tradition, before you were capable of evaluating it. And what was installed was a specifically Western Christian program that tells you at the somatic level, below argument, below evidence, below every reasonable thing you now know, that you arrived in the world already wrong. Eastern Christians who lose their faith do not typically describe this same pattern, not in the same quality, not with the same persistence, because the Eastern tradition never told them they were born condemned. When they lose the belief, they lose a tradition, but they don't wake up at 2 in the morning with a pre-rational conviction that they are fundamentally, irreparably wrong. The installation wasn't made. The 2 in the morning feeling is not a universal human response to losing faith. It is a specific response to a specific kind of faith, a faith that told you what you were before you could evaluate what you were being told. Here is the thing I wish someone had said to me the day I walked out. The guilt that stayed after the belief left is not proof that you were wrong to leave. It is not evidence that somewhere inside you still knows the truth. It is not God's voice. It is not your conscience speaking in a language deeper than reason. It is a mechanism designed in 418 to outlast the belief that carried it. That's not an abstract historical point. That is the truth of what you've been feeling. Now you know where it came from. Spinoza, at the end of his analysis of how religious institutions maintain control, does not say, "Understand the mechanism," and it disappears. He says something more honest and more useful. "Understand what the mechanism is doing," he says, "and then you can begin to be free of it." Not immediately, not automatically, but the understanding is the beginning. The guilt doesn't vanish the moment you understand its history. I won't tell you that. What changes is what the guilt means when it arrives. It used to mean something about me. About my nature, about my distance from God, about some fundamental wrongness that was built into who I am before I thought my first thought. Now, when it arrives at 2 in the morning, I know what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a Latin translation error that the man who made it couldn't detect. I'm dealing with a British monk who said you were born free and was condemned by men who understood exactly what his position cost them. I'm dealing with 14 Eastern bishops who looked at the evidence and said, "We examined this man and he is not a heretic." And a North African bishop who wrote a book to explain why those 14 bishops were wrong. I'm dealing with a canon voted on in 418 in North Africa that needed to be reinforced again in 529 because the doctrine kept coming loose. And when I know what I'm dealing with, it loses the authority it had when I didn't know. The guilt was installed, and now you know who installed it, and when and why, and what they were afraid of when they did it. That's yours now. Make of that what you will. I want to ask you something specific before you go. Before this video, before the Synod of Diospolis, before the Pelagian acquittal, before the translation error in Romans 5:12, did you know that the guilt doctrine you were raised with was contested at its origin? Did you know that bishops who examined it firsthand disagreed? Did anyone in your tradition ever mention that the Eastern Church takes a different position and always has? Write that in the comments. Tell me what you knew before this video and what landed differently just now. And if you're one of the Eastern Orthodox viewers who watches this channel, if you were raised in a tradition that never taught inherited guilt, I genuinely want to hear from you. What is it like to watch Western ex-Christians describe a guilt response that your tradition never installed? That conversation matters. And I'll be reading.